Welcome to the review video for Old Testament chronology final exam. And this is the last of our video in series, and so hopefully this will help you on the exam. I'm going to start by going over what kind of questions are on the exam. I will say this, that there are a lot of questions on the exam. I'm going to try to cover everything that's on here, all right? But obviously, I can't remember every question exactly, and I'm not reading off the exam. So make sure that you do watch this video quite a bit. I'm sure you'll do very well if you do. And maybe glance over some of your notes, some of the other stuff that was important if I don't mention it on the video here. All right, the exam starts with the first page is short answer questions. And so those might be a little bit more difficult. Then there's about a page and a half of multiple choice questions, which means the right answer is there. You just got to know which one it is. And then there is about a 3/4 of a page of true and false questions. All right, and then there are several different matching sections. There is a matching section that deals with people's names and what they mean. There's a matching section matching different judges and what is known about that judge. There's a matching section dealing with some of the important kings of the northern kingdom. A matching section matching some of the important kings of the southern kingdom. There's a matching section matching different prophets that were mentioned. And several, of course, we mentioned in the last day of lectures, all right? And then there is a matching section dealing with some of the visions and prophecies found in the book of Daniel. All right, so as you can tell, about the last page or so of the test deals with stuff that we covered in class last week. And so make sure that you do look over those notes for sure. There are 2 essay questions on here. Now, I will say that one of those essay questions you've seen before. In fact, very recently before. One of the essay questions you have not seen before. Probably because we just dealt with it in the last lesson. And so hopefully that will give you enough hints there to help you out with that. I've also included a couple of bonus questions, which I am very confident that you'll be able to get right as long as you do them. And so that will help you. You could get a possibility of 102% if you get an absolutely perfect quiz or test. All right, let's go on to some of the information that you might see on this test. Starting with the creation stage. We mentioned that the creation stage covers the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. And of course, those 11 chapters are important. Why? Because most of the important Bible doctrines are first mentioned in the 11 chapters. We also mentioned the fact that that Genesis creation stage covers 2,000 years of human history. We mentioned 3 important people in the creation stage. That would be Adam, Enoch, and Noah. And we also mentioned 4 important events that took place in the creation stage. That is the creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. One of those important dates that we've mentioned over and over and over since the beginning of the class. Obviously, you would know that James Ussher believed that the world started, the creation, the world began on October 23rd. 4004 BC. And so that would be definitely a date to remember since James Ussher wrote our textbook. We also mentioned the word universe, which comes from 2 Latin words, uni and verse, which means a single spoken sentence. And of course, that is how the world was created when God said, "Let there be." We also mentioned in the creation that something special that we don't have today is before the flood, there appears to have been a water canopy that surrounded the world and protected it from a lot of the UV light rays and many of the things that cause us to get old and wrinkly today. We mentioned, of course, the fall of man, and we talked about the fact that before man fell, of course, Satan fell. But Satan's fall happened after creation week, all right? He was not a fallen angel during creation week, all right? His fall happened after creation week. We mentioned with the fall of man, of course, man ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we mentioned the fact that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, nowhere in the Bible does it say that it was the most beautiful tree in the garden. In fact, all the trees were pleasant to the eyes. all of them were good for food. It was just simply the tree that we couldn't have. Of course, we mentioned that when man sinned, he hid from God. And of course, God went to the garden as he normally did to talk to man. And God asked questions like, "Where are you, Adam?" He asked several questions. And we mentioned the fact that when God asks questions, he's not looking for information. Rather, he's helping us think about where we are. And of course, that definitely was applicable there. We mentioned, of course, Cain and Abel being the first children born. Of course, Abel was murdered by Cain. And we mentioned the fact that Abel's name means breath or vapor. And of course, that makes sense because his life was pretty much a vapor. We mentioned that Cain, of course, murdered Abel as a result of God rejecting his sacrifice. He brought the fruit from his fields, the best fruits he had, and that really represents man trying to work his way to heaven. And of course, Abel brought a lamb, which represents the Lamb of God. We mentioned the line of Cain had several important people, but one of note was Lamech. He was the first polygamist and also the first serial killer. Of course, there were plenty other people in Cain's lineage, but Lamech definitely was an important one. We mentioned, of course, many important people in Seth's lineage. And of course, Seth was the third son of Adam and Eve, and his name means appointed by God. He was the one that kind of replaced Abel in a sense. And of course, we mentioned it was in Seth's lineage that we had Enoch, seventh from Adam. He was a preacher of the coming judgment. Of course, he is one of two men that did not die. He was translated to heaven. Of course, the other we talked about in the last lecture, actually, Elijah, who was taken to heaven by a whirlwind. We mentioned that Enoch had a son named Methuselah, whose name meant after this the judgment. And of course, we mentioned the fact that when Methuselah died, the flood began. And of course, that was a prophecy of that. Methuselah was also the oldest man to ever live at 969 years of age. Of course, the man who got us through the flood was that preacher of righteousness, Noah. His name means rest or repose. And of course, Noah, with his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, helped build that ark. And of course, we tend to think that Shem was the oldest because his name comes first. But when we consult the Bible, we realize that actually Japheth was the oldest of Noah's sons. The Bible clearly calls him Japheth the elder. We also mentioned the fact of the reason for the flood was that the sons of God came to the daughters of men. And regardless of how you see that passage, the result were giants in the earth. And so definitely it was a wicked place to be. We mentioned after the flood that Noah, of course, got off the ark. And we mentioned that one of Noah's sons, Ham, saw Noah in his nakedness. And he told his other brothers about it. And we mentioned the fact that Noah did something interesting. He didn't curse Ham himself, but he cursed Ham's fourth-born son, Canaan. And of course, that is where the Canaanites came from. We mentioned the fact that Noah and his family were on the ark, and they were on the ark for 1 year and 10 days. Now, I know, of course, we sing in songs, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, but they were actually on the ark for 1 year and 10 days. We went over in class several different flood legends. In fact, there's over 270 different flood legends. And one of the flood legends that we mentioned that were really a unique flood legend was from the Toltec Indians of Mexico. And that flood legend not only has the flood in it, it also talks about the Tower of Babel. And so it has both stories there. Another flood legend that we mentioned was one of the very oldest, and that is the Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh that talks about a worldwide flood. In the lineage of Noah's different sons, of course, Shem was the lineage through which Christ came. And we mentioned several people of importance in Shem's lineage. Of course, Eber is who we believe the name Hebrew came from. We also mentioned Peleg, and it was during his time that the earth was divided. We also mentioned a man by the name of Nimrod. Now, he did not come through Shem's lineage, but Nimrod, he was the mighty hunter before the Lord. He is the one that founded Babylon. He's the one that founded the building project of the Tower of Babel, and a very wicked man. We mentioned, of course, Abraham comes on the scene right around 2008. And so we see Abraham coming in there. It's interesting how major events in history happen kind of at the 500 marks. Of course, 2000 was when Abraham was born. The temple was built around 1000, and David was around the year 1000 as well. And the entering into the promised land was around 1500. And so it's kind of interesting to see how those different dates come on the 500s. We mentioned the patriarchal stage, and we mentioned the four patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. We mentioned, of course, Abraham came from the city Ur of Chaldea, and of course he was told to leave Ur of Chaldea to go into the land of promise. His father left with them, Terah. They went a little ways outside of Ur, actually quite a little ways outside of Ur, but they did not make it all the way to the promised land. And we mentioned the fact that Terah's name means delay. They stopped in Haran and stayed for a while, and that was kind of a delay for Abram. We mentioned the fact that God used a King Chedorlaomer to wipe out lots of the giants that lived in the promised land, which, of course, he did promise to Abram. We mentioned that Abram, when he went to rescue his nephew Lot, when he was taken captive, after the victory, encountered Melchizedek, who we believe is a pre-incarnate of Jesus Christ. Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God. And we mentioned Melchizedek is the first instance in which the word priest is used. We also talked about Abram, the difference between Abram and Abraham. Of course, we mentioned Abram means high father. Abraham means father of a multitude. We also mentioned Sarai's name. Sarai means contention, and Sarah means princess. And it is interesting how God uses their names in different ways in their lives. We mentioned, of course, the different groups of people that came from different Bible characters. Of course, we mentioned Lot was the father of the Moabites and the Ammonites. We mentioned that Abraham was actually the father of the Midianites through his wife Keturah. Of course, Abraham's main son is his only begotten son, you might say, according to God, Isaac. He was born to Abram when he was 100 years old. Sarah was 90 years old. Abram was 100 years old. Of course, his name means laughter, because they both laughed at the thought of Isaac being born. We mentioned a very important date, and of course, because this is chronology class, we know that these kind of things are pretty important. We mentioned that at Isaac's 5th year of life, at the feast celebrating his 5th year, that was when the beginning of the 400 years of persecution for the nation of Israel. And of course, we mentioned that important date. We mentioned that Abraham is told by God to offer up his son Isaac, and he goes to fulfill that in a mountain called Mount Moriah. And of course, we know God spared Isaac, and he went on to marry Rebekah. And when Isaac was 60 years of age, he had twin sons, and that is Esau and Jacob. Of course, Abraham dies at 175 years of age, a ripe old age. Isaac, of course, as I mentioned, married Rebekah and has 2 sons at age 60. And then at age 77, 77 for Jacob, not for Isaac, Jacob deceives his father and ends up leaving and going to Laban and finding his own wives. Of course, he married Leah and Rachel and the 2 handmaidens as well. And of course, we mentioned the chronology behind that. He was 77 years old when that took place. We think of him as a young man, but he really wasn't. We mentioned, of course, Jacob's name means deceiver, and he definitely did a lot of deception during his time. Of course, Jacob's favorite son, Joseph, his first begotten from Rachel, was born when Jacob was 91 years of age. And Joseph's name means God will give. And of course, it was a very exciting time for Rachel, having her first child after being barren for so long. Of course, Rachel was not the best kind of wife for Jacob. Rachel was the one that stole Laban's household gods. And Rachel was the one that kind of caused a lot of problems in the home. We mentioned the fact that Jacob later has his name changed from Jacob, and God calls him Israel. That is where we get the name of the nation of Israel. And of course, Israel means prince. We mentioned, of course, Joseph becomes the fourth patriarch, and Joseph, of course, is sold into slavery by his own brethren, but that was all part of God's plan, because later God brings Israel into Egypt to protect him from famine. And Joseph is the vice-pharaoh or viceroy of Egypt at the time. Of course, he gives them the best land in Egypt, and that would be the land of Goshen. We mentioned in the Exodus stage, which is our next stage, 4 books of the Bible in that Exodus stage: Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We also mentioned 4 important people during that time: Moses, Aaron, Caleb, and Joshua. We mentioned, of course, during the Exodus stage, we have a 40-year-old Moses killing an Egyptian, thinking that he would bring the children of Israel out of Egypt. Of course, that doesn't happen until he's later 80 years of age. He brings the nation of Israel out. Of course, we mentioned there were several different plagues that God used. And luckily for you, there is no matching section of the plagues. I know how much you enjoyed that section, but I did take that out, all right? We mentioned the next stage was the conquest stage. And this was a shorter stage that we mentioned. The conquest stage only lasted for about 25 years. We mentioned 3 important people in this stage: Joshua, Caleb, and Rahab. And of course, we mentioned the fact that this was when they took over the promised land. Of course, that started by crossing the Jordan River, and that was done when the priests with the Ark of the Covenant put their feet in the water. And of course, the river split. We mentioned the very first city they took over, the city of Jericho. And we talked about how the city of Jericho had multiple walls, and those walls fell down, and God actually used those walls as a ramp for Israel to be able to get up into the area of Jericho and destroy Jericho. We mentioned that Jericho did have some problems, though. There was a man by the name of Achan who stole some of the spoil that God said not to steal, and of course they were cursed as a result of that. Later on, of course, God had told Joshua and the people not to make a covenant with any Canaanites. And we do know that there was a sneaky group of Canaanites called the Hivites that actually tricked them into making an agreement with them. And of course, that has caused Israel much trouble since then. Going on to the next stage, we talked about the Judges stage. And of course, that's found in the book of Judges and Ruth and part of 1 Samuel. And we mentioned that in the book of Judges, there were 7 apostasies, 7 servitudes, 7 heathen nations, and 7 deliverances. We mentioned several important judges. Of course, the very first judge was Othniel. He was the son-in-law of Caleb, and he was the very first judge. Of course, we mentioned Ehud, that left-handed judge that killed King Eglon, the really fat king. Of course, we also mentioned Deborah, the only lady judge in Israel. And of course, she, along with Barak, got a great victory. We also mentioned Gideon. And of course, we know Gideon is the one who, with his 300 men, destroyed a great army of the Midianites. We mentioned, not really considered a judge, but we did mention Abimelech, who was the son of Gideon's concubine. He actually wiped out almost all of Gideon's children, and for 3 years ruled over Israel and caused a lot of problems. We also mentioned Jephthah, and of course we talked quite in depth about his rash vow that he made and really kind of overshadowed the rest of his life. We also mentioned Samson, of course, that super strong judge, but no matter how strong he was, he did have one weakness, and that was for Philistine women. We also mentioned the judge Eli, and of course Eli and Samson very likely judged at the same time. And so Samson was probably the military judge, Eli, of course, the high priest. We also mentioned that after Eli was a judge Samuel, and Samuel, a lot of his judgeship time happened during the very first king of Israel's time, that is King Saul. Going on to the United Kingdom, of course, we mentioned King Saul. He was from the smallest tribe. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, and he started out as a very good king. Unfortunately, very quickly turned to be a bad king, and but he is known as the very first king of Israel. Of course, we mentioned the very first three kings have something kind of unique. They all served for 40 years. Saul served for 40 years, David served for 40 years, and Solomon served for 40 years, which equals 120 years for the United Kingdom. We also mentioned King David, and of course we went through lots of different jobs that he did. Of course, his very first job, in which he was actually anointed king, he was a shepherd. And we talked about the fact that he went through several different jobs, kind of ups and downs. Of course, probably one of the highlights was when he killed the giant Goliath, and that also caused some problems for him with King Saul, of course. We mentioned the fact that David was anointed king. He was king over Judah for 7 years and 6 months, and then finally, after finishing a civil war, became king over all of Israel. Of course, we mentioned David's son Solomon. Solomon, of course, is known for a couple of things. He's known as being the wisest man in all the world. He's also known for building the temple. And Solomon had a good friend, the king of Hiram, king of Tyre, who helped him with the building of that, of course, giving him cedar trees and helping him with some craftsmen that could help him build certain things. Going on to the divided kingdom, probably one of the more difficult kingdoms that we dealt with. And of course, I mentioned that there's a matching section with the northern kings and the southern kings. All right, let me tell you about the different kings that I think are important. Of course, we've got the very first king of the northern kingdom. That would be Jeroboam the first. He is the one that built those two golden calves and started really Israel into idolatry of the northern kingdom. Of course, there was a king named Baasha. God had prophesied that Jeroboam's family would be wiped out, and Baasha was the one that fulfilled that prophecy. Of course, Baasha wasn't a very good king himself, but he did fulfill that prophecy. We mentioned the king that ruled the shortest time of all the kingdoms, and that was Zimri. He only ruled for 7 days, and then, of course, he killed himself. Omri was the one that actually caused him to kill himself. Omri, of course, fought a civil war with somebody else who tried to become the king. Omri eventually won that civil war and became the king of Israel. Omri's very heinous son, Ahab, became the next king of Israel. And of course, Ahab is known for lots of wicked things, but definitely he is known for marrying Jezebel, that very wicked queen. We mentioned as well another famous king in the northern kingdom, and that was Jehu. God used Jehu to fulfill a prophecy by wiping out the lineage of Ahab. He also used him to take out the priests of Baal by tricking them into thinking that he was going to make a big sacrifice. And we mentioned the funny instance that he turned the temple of Baal into a public restroom. And that was kind of a funny little thing there. We mentioned another kind of important king, Pekah, and he was really the next to the last king of the northern kingdom. It was during his kingdom that part of the northern kingdom was carried away captive. Almost kind of a warning. And of course, the next king, Hoshea, didn't heed that warning. And it was during Hoshea's time that the entire northern kingdom was carried away by Assyria. And that marks the end of the northern kingdom. Talking about the kings of the southern kingdom, of course, we have King Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. It was under his kingdom that the kingdom was divided because he wouldn't listen to good advice. We mentioned another good king, King Asa. And of course, he did some wonderful things. Of course, we mentioned he kind of turned Judah kind of back to God. We mentioned that in his 15th year, he had some problems with Baasha, king of the northern kingdom. And of course, we mentioned a supposed contradiction found in the Bible. Of course, it's not a contradiction. We don't believe the Bible has contradictions or the Bible is wrong. It mentions the 36th year of Asa. And of course, we mentioned that that is not dealing with his 36th year as being king, because Baasha started being king when it was the 3rd year of Asa, and he only ruled for 24 years. So Baasha died in Asa's 27th year. We mentioned the fact that the 36th year is in reference to the fact that the kingdom was divided 36 years before. And of course, so we mentioned that. So really, Baasha started causing problems in Asa's 15th year, the 36th year of the divided kingdom. We also mentioned his son Jehoshaphat. And of course, Jehoshaphat was a great king, led Judah in a great revival. Unfortunately, Jehoshaphat did have a problem. He did a lot of compromising with Ahab and both of his sons. And of course, we mentioned that as well. Another great king of the southern kingdom was Uzziah. And of course, Uzziah did a lot of great things. Unfortunately, he tried to take over the priest's office, and God smote him with leprosy. And his son Jotham had to reign in his stead. We mentioned, of course, another great king, King Hezekiah, and he did a lot of wonderful things. One of the things he's known about is God told him he was going to die. He prayed and asked to be healed, and God answered his prayer. And as a sign of that, he moved the sun 10 degrees backwards, and Hezekiah saw that. Hezekiah did have a son during that last 15 years of life named Manasseh. Manasseh, one of the most wicked kings in both Israel and Judah. He is the longest ruling king of both kingdoms. He ruled for 55 years. Another famous king in the southern kingdom was King Josiah. And of course, he was that 8-year-old king that they found the book of the law during his reign, and he led in a great revival. We also mentioned some of the latter kings. Of course, we know we mentioned quite a bit about Jehoiachin or Jeconias. Of course, he also became a viceroy at age 8, later became the sole king at age 18. We mentioned that supposed Bible contradiction and the answer to that. The one thing that we know about Jehoiachin, though, was that he had a curse placed on him, that none of his blood relatives would sit on the throne of David. And of course, we mentioned that Christ was related to King Jehoiachin not by blood, but through his adoption to Joseph there. We also mentioned the last king of the southern kingdom, King Zedekiah, and that, of course, was when the city of Jerusalem fell. Some of the prophets that we mentioned during this time, important prophets, of course, we mentioned Elijah. Elijah was a great prophet that declared a 3-year drought during King Ahab's reign. He's also a prophet that was taken to heaven by a whirlwind. We mentioned the prophet Elisha, who took over for Elijah. And Elisha is known for doing more miracles than anyone else except for Jesus and Moses. We also mentioned Joel, the prophet. He prophesied about the coming of the Holy Spirit. And by the way, that was fulfilled at Pentecost. And Peter actually quotes from the book of Joel. We mentioned, of course, the prophet Jonah, who preached a great revival in Nineveh, even if he didn't want to. He certainly did. We mentioned the prophet Hosea, who is quoted over 30 times in the New Testament. We mentioned Isaiah, and there was so much about Isaiah that we mentioned. Of course, Isaiah is the most quoted of all the Old Testament books in the New Testament. We also mentioned Habakkuk, the very last of the minor prophets to the southern kingdom before the invasion of Babylon. Then we mentioned Jeremiah. He, of course, is known as the weeping prophet. The next stage that we covered was the captivity stage. And of course, once again, we're in chronology class, so hopefully we would know that the captivity stage started in 605 BC. Of course, 2 prophets during this time were Daniel and Ezekiel. Daniel, of course, was taken captive. He was the preacher to the upper class that was taken captive in Babylon. And God used him to interpret several dreams and interpret several visions. And we mentioned that. Of course, the very first one that he interpreted was Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the great image that was a metallic image. And of course, that was a prophecy of the four great empires as seen from man's perspective, as great metals like gold and silver and brass and iron. Of course, later, Daniel has a vision of his own of four beasts. And of course, we mentioned that that is also the same four empires, but it's from God's perspective. And that's the way God sees man's governments. We mentioned a couple other visions that were given during Daniel's time. He had the vision of the ram and the he-goat, which was a vision of the fall of the Medo-Persian Empire. And of course, it was conquered by Alexander the Great. We mentioned Daniel's 70 weeks, which is a prophecy of what God, how God would get Israel right with him. And of course, we spent quite a little bit of time talking about Daniel's 70 weeks and the minuteness of that prophecy. And of course, then we concluded with the prophecies of the kings of the north and south. And of course, that was about 300 years of prophecies of wars between Syria and Egypt over the Holy Land. And a very, very accurate prophecy of that time. Of course, we mentioned Ezekiel. We didn't talk quite a bit about Ezekiel. Ezekiel, of course, was a prophet to the working class people that were captives in Babylon. Ezekiel was taken captive during Jehoiachin's captivity, and we mentioned that. The final stage we mentioned was the return stage, and we mentioned that some of the important people, the return stage, Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah. We mentioned that there were 3 separate returns. Of course, Zerubbabel was the first one, Ezra, and then Nehemiah. We mentioned that during Zerubbabel's return, God used 2 prophets to help him during that time, Haggai and Zechariah. And we talked about those guys. Of course, Ezra was a priest, and he helped Israel kind of get right with God. And then God also used Nehemiah, who returned to help rebuild the wall. Of course, they rebuilt that wall in 52 days. We mentioned Esther. Of course, Queen Esther is kind of at the tail end of that period of time. Esther is the one book of the Bible that does not have the name of God in it, but we can see God behind the scenes throughout it. We also mentioned the fact that it's very possible that Esther was the queen when Nehemiah asked to be able to go back and rebuild the wall, and that's kind of a neat thing. Of course, we concluded, I think, a very exciting part of a conclusion. We talked about the very last prophecy of the Bible in the Old Testament, found in the book of Malachi, where it says that Elijah the prophet would come back before the great and terrible day of the Lord. And we mentioned the fact that that was a unique prophecy because it appears that it could have been fulfilled earlier on during the gospel times through John the Baptist. John the Baptist, of course, fit the prophecy of Malachi as the messenger coming before Messiah, and that is quoted by Jesus. Jesus in Matthew chapter 11 even said, if you will accept John, he will be Elijah for to come. Of course, later on in Matthew chapter 17, John the Baptist had already been executed, and Jesus made the statement, John could have been the Elijah for to come, but Elijah will come back. And of course, we mentioned that because Israel did not accept the forerunner of Messiah or Messiah, they will have to accept him later on. Of course, we believe that Elijah will come back during the tribulation, probably as one of the 2 witnesses. I believe that is a good rendition of some of the things that you will see on there. I think I've covered most everything. Hope that you'll take time and very much study very hard. This is your last opportunity to get a good grade. So watch it several times and do a great job in praying for you. See you on Thursday.